Mhm. Well, welcome. Peace Week 2022 is going strong. We're coming towards the end of day two. And of course, Peace Week is orientated around the International Day of Peace, which this year is Wednesday, and it's always the 21st of September. And perhaps along with Earth Day, our most sophisticated and advanced planetary day. So certainly something worth celebrating, and this year being the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the first observance of the International Day of Peace. And I am honored and delighted to be here with you with a brand new program on behalf of my co-host, Patrick Carolan, and the team, Peter Blaise Corcoran and others. We are bringing religion to the rescue. And in religion to the rescue, we're asking the question, in the world that is going towards wholeness and healing, what is the value and role of religion? And when we were discussing who we might want to begin this episode one, at the very top are the two speakers who graciously said yes today. I want to welcome Mary Evelyn Tucker and Brian McLaren to Peace Week. Mary Evelyn, it's great to see you.
Lovely to be here, Ben. Thank you.
And Brian, thank you for coming back once again, brother.
Great to be with you, and great to be with Mary Evelyn, whose work I've admired for many, many years. So happy to be here.
Now, just by way of a brief introduction, Mary Evelyn Tucker, known perhaps to many, if not most of us here today, is a senior lecturer and research scholar at Yale University, where she has appointments in the School of the Environment, as well as the Divinity School and the Department of Religious Studies. She teaches in the joint MA program in Religion and Ecology and directs the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology with her husband, John Grimm. Brian, D Mclaren, is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. A former college English teacher and pastor, he is a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He is a core faculty member of the Living School and podcaster with Learning How to See, which are part of the Center for Action and Contemplation. He's also an Auburn Senior Fellow and is co-host of Southern Lights. His newest books are Faith After Doubt, which was out last year, and Do I Stay Christian, it came out in May this year. So Mary Evelyn and Brian McLaren, let's get into it. The presiding question that we're really asking in religion to the rescue is, at this time of such a deep personal and global call to transformation, which is felt almost I won't say universally, but it is felt so deep and far and wide. It is definitely global, and it is intercultural, it is intergenerational, it's definitely interfaith and interspiritual. This call to personal and transformational and global transformation. What is the value and role of religion? And Mary Evelyn, I'm going to ask you that question first.
Well, thank you, Ben. I actually want to start with the sense that everything we do, we say first, there's problems and promise about religion. And you've highlighted that in the description of this. But I want to really give a shout out for what Brian has done to elevate that discussion and to put it out there that religions aren't perfect, and yet why are they necessary? And I want to also give a shout out to Brian's work, in the environment. The 6-minute talk he did at the Parliament of World Religions is just superb. I hope everybody can see it at some point. And his book on the Galapagos, A Spiritual Journey, where he talks about a wild theology and drawing on the fish and animal world. This is tremendous. This is where we need to go. So I'm very excited, about that opening that Brian has done and many others are beginning to do. We have this program at Yale that's taken a long, long time, frankly, for an academic community to understand. But I feel we're at this new moment of saying, frankly, no, I'll keep it short here because I prepared lots of notes, but that science, policy, law, economics, technology, necessary but not sufficient on the environment. And that's going to be my primary focus, obviously. But the moral force of religious communities the spiritual dimensions of them, the ethical depths are absolutely necessary, and people are realizing this. And then wonderful thing is, that Brian's bringing this forth within Christianity, among many things that he's doing, and others are. Then we've got this interreligious groups, the Parliament of World Religions, the United Religions Initiative, the Religions for Peace. The Vatican Council in the 1960s was the first moment that this huge church, Catholic Church, said there's truth in other religions. We've come so far on the interreligious dialogue, really exciting. And the environment, social justice are key elements for the engagement of these religions. And the work even beyond that, the interspiritual work, the intercultural work, the intergenerational work that Ben and Patrick and Peter Blaze, that you're all pushing forward. This is a leading edge too of saying, of course, humans are spiritual in their essence, in their body-mind system. And that energy needs to be brought forth for hope and for engagement. And that is why the religions need to be involved. And our students see that, and they're gaining more and more hope because they know they can make a difference through their spiritual articulation, their ethical commitments. It's a very exciting moment.
Beautiful, beautiful framing, Mary Evelyn, of the optimism, but also with acknowledging the challenges. And, there's so much one could say and has been said, and rightly so, that is deeply critical of religion. What I love about the approach that Brian takes is it's self-critique, because criticizing other religions hasn't actually worked out very well for anybody. Those doing the criticizing end up ostracizing themselves, and the ones that are being criticized, generally aren't receptive to the feedback. So, the only real kind of transformation in a critical sense is self-criticism. And I think, Brian, you've been an incredible leader in looking at Christianity and having a balanced view of what's working and what's not working, and some of the deeper reasons inside that. So perhaps as we begin to answer these questions together, let's hear your opening salvo, if you like, in a response to Mary Evelyn.
Well, again, it's a great honor to be with you, Ben, and with Mary Evelyn and Patrick and all the folks who are listening. This is a joint venture. The changes that are needed have to happen in each of us and then among us and through us to affect other people. I just came across this new book called When Time is Short by Timothy Beal, another professor of religion and Christian theologian, a student of Walter Brueggemann. And he quotes a very important essay from back in 1967 that anyone who has studied the environmental movement would know of this essay by Lynn White Jr. called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And here's what Lynn White wrote way back in 1967. Both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with Orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature that no solution for our ecological crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. We must rethink and refeel our nature and destiny. What a powerful quote. And it feels as relevant and true today as it did in 1967. And I love his words, refeel and rethink, because I think this is one of the things that religion is about. It's about the head and the heart. It's about the body and the mind, or the soul, however we want to describe it. It's about our whole being and taking seriously not only our thoughts and our policies and our programs, but also our values and the story that we believe that we're part of and that we're participating in. And this to me is one of the reasons I'm so happy to be with Mary Evelyn, because one of the ways that our religious communities, and especially Orthodox Christianity, one of the ways we've caused so much trouble is by telling stories that have been harmful to individuals, harmful to communities, and harmful to our planet. One of those stories being that this world doesn't matter, and really that the religious message is just an evacuation plan to get to heaven after we die, and then this whole world is just kind of like a candy wrapper, and God is going to extract the chocolate bar and throw everything else away. And part of what's happening is we're restoring, we're trying to tell a sacred story about what it means to be human beings and live on this planet with this history, with this amazing unfolding evolutionary processes, and with this set of huge challenges we face at this moment, to tell this story in a way that inspires us all for sustained action, including sustained action in the middle of setbacks and what seem like catastrophic mistakes. And that is deeply religious, spiritual, humane work that we're all involved with.
I love that. Can I just jump in here?
Please, Mary Evelyn, yes.
Well, I love that because, of course, Thomas Berry had that notion of a new story in 1978 when he wrote that very key essay. And he's saying, as many of us know now, we have to have a scientific story and a spiritual story integrated. And that's why we made Journey of the Universe and so on. But this sense of new stories are emerging all over. And that's what's so exciting, that in everything we've tried to do in this forum on religion and ecology, we're saying, how can we retrieve, reevaluate, and reconstruct these incredible religious traditions? I mean, that's what theologians have done forever with the Christian tradition. So that's part of the hope and possibility of change. I mean, we've been doing this for feminist theology. We've been doing it for Black theology and so on. And, I feel this moral force. So many of us were deeply affected by the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? And the anti-Vietnam War movement. I was in college in Washington, D.C., where Nancy Pelosi went and many others. And we were deeply involved in these protest movements. But, in those years, it was separate but equal. That was okay until the religious communities and leaders like Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and so many others came on board and said, this is morally unacceptable. And that's the moment that we have now. And I love that Lynn White was brought back into the discussion because he said it so clearly, so well, that religions are indispensable to this transformative moment. And as I say, we have technology, carbon sequestration, et cetera. Our School of the Environment is talking about all these things all the time. But the missing link that's right here now and on the horizon to be generated even further is this tremendous moral force of activism and a deepening of what it is the traditions can actually offer. So we like to say a field is emerging in academia, in seminaries. There are now 14 graduate programs in religion and ecology, which we just discovered a couple of months ago. It's actually booming. And of course, Green Faith and so many others are doing this tremendous activism on the ground. And all over the world, there's engaged projects. You can see these on the website. So I love the wild theology of Brian and eco-theology of many others. We have to deepen, expand the worldview and the action in the world for these changes. And it is happening. It is truly an exciting moment in that regard.
Brian, can I just jump in and a reflection? So often we are meeting people, Mary Evelyn and Brian, who have dedicated and devoted their life to the cause, whatever that particular cause may be for them, and often, particularly over these last few years, have been so challenging. Often we see a little bit of browbeatenness at times of people, and a little bit of not resignation, but it's tough, working in this transformational space. But I just want to really shout out to you, Mary Evelyn, the energy and the optimism and the hope and the conviction is just radiating from you, and it's affecting all of us at the moment. So thank you so much for that. That gives us a bright light, Brian. Mary Evelyn actually had a question for you. We asked each of you to prepare a question for the other as we answer this big question: where's religion going? What's its service look like to the world that's becoming more unified, more whole, and healed? And Mary Evelyn's question for you, Brian, is this: what are the key issues that religion should be addressing now? What should religions be focusing on right now, Brian Mclaren?
So the one, Mary Evelyn, that to me catapults right to the very top is this. And I think this might surprise people, but I really think without this, we miss the real fulcrum, or the real leverage point. And it is this: do we have a way to measure value that is other than money?
Yes.
Because it seems to me what has happened in so many of the problems of religion are the result of religion becoming captive to money. Because religious communities are donor-driven organizations like political parties, and frankly, like university research programs. Suddenly we realize that the problems in religion overlap with the problems in much of the academy and in politics and so on. But when we realize that religion has been captured by money, in a certain sense, for our religious communities to rediscover their real contribution, they have to find a way to say, we are celebrating values, we're fomenting desires, we're stimulating imagination that is willing to defy the sovereignty of money. If we could start there, if we could focus there, I think this would be revolutionary. And without it, I think we so many of our efforts will just be undercut from the start. Second thing I'd say that in many ways is bigger, but I think actually relates to this power of money, is exactly the work, Mary Evelyn, that you've been involved with trying to integrate a spiritual story with our best scientific understandings. And when we realize that all of our religious traditions arose during a period when what we know now as science wasn't even part of the human equation. In a certain sense, you could say that the storytelling of ancient cultures was the way that they did science. It was the way that they proposed hypotheses. Tell a story, see what this story can explain. And I think it's Dominic Crossan who says, it's not that ancient people were so stupid to take their stories literally and modern people are now becoming smart enough to take them figuratively. It's that ancient people were way more literary than we modern people have been with our religious texts. But all that's to say, we're at this juncture of creative possibility, of integrating the best of our scientific understanding, the best of our religious understanding, and letting that literacy cross-pollinate and produce new imagination and new vision. And so I would say those two things: money and telling an integrated story that could really help us.
I really want to jump in and respond. That was just so eloquent and perceptive, Brian. Really deep and helpful. Why? Because especially in our culture, and unfortunately it's spread around the world, it's the American dream is materialism gone mad. Absolute things rather than being, and so on. And that is a problem, one of the most critical problems of American society. But as I say, because it's been put around the world, I've been in Dubai, where consumption is over the top. China, even Japan picked it up early on. But anyway, it is all over the world now. And that sense of what is it that we value? I mean, people's hearts and minds are collapsing because materialism is so empty. And so why are people seeking all kinds of spiritual paths, which is frankly a great thing, because we've got to get out of this materialist madness. And the other, again, I thank you for this point on this, the spiritual, the scientific, and an integrated story with science too, because in academia, and this becomes part of the breakdown in society as a whole, we have science as the truth in a reductionist model that says empiricism reigns as we objectify the natural world. But when an empirical method becomes a worldview, we have destroyed relationality with the natural world. So science and religious understanding in academia, by and large, is so split. I want to give one, and that affects the whole society. Our students can't integrate this, and they feel, I use the word advisedly, but very schizophrenic, very divided, and deeply depressed, frankly. And when Journey of the Universe, when they watch it and when they read this book, I've had a student, more than one in my office, and this one student was crying. He says, now I know where I belong and how I belong. And it creates that sense of energy for the changes that need to happen. So, and the other thing I just want to bring into this, because I'm sure we all agree, but of course, indigenous traditions and their understanding of the natural world are crucial. And I want to say a shift just happened at Yale a week ago when a Hawaiian woman made a presentation about the island of Oahu and the livingness of the mountain that was rejecting roads being built on it, and saying this is an animate and a world of agency that has never been said before in the same way. So I think these are really exciting openings when indigenous viewpoints can be held up and respected once again.
Magnificent. Yeah, a very rich response to Brian's very thoughtful offering. And you know, we're really blessed here in Peace Week and Unity Earth and our frame that we're connected to have such input from Indigenous leaders and elders from across the world, with faith leaders and spiritual leaders. And it's interesting to me about the institution, because the word religion, of course, is so broad. It depends what we're actually talking about. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on the future of institutional religion, as well as the deeper, higher meaning of the word religion in its perhaps more beautiful, idealistic sense. But the future of the institution would be very interesting to talk about as we go forward through these evolutionary times. And maybe Brian's question for you, Mary Evelyn, could help us lead us into looking at religion as an institutional phenomena and what its future may be, or its evolutionary journey may be in these times. So Brian's question for you, Mary Evelyn, is this: for religion to be more part of the solution and less part of the problem, some things will need to change. And those changes will need to happen at the congregational level: churches, synagogues, mosques, gurdwaras, etc. What changes would you most encourage congregational leaders to prioritize?
Well, again, it's a superb question, because I think I'm not trying to be like everything's perfect, but by no means. I went to a conference in Denmark this summer that was on the poly crisis, which is what the Europeans are calling it. You know, it's politics, just as you said, politics, society, economics, and the environment, and climate change. But the condition on which 100 environmentalists from around the world came to that conference, the organizers said they have had to internalize collapse, that we are on the edge of overshoot of all these systems. That's including water that we've just been talking about, the carbon cycle, all these great cycles, the nitrogen cycle, are being overused, overextended. So what does that mean for religions? Now, I'm just going to say there are different levels here. right? So we have leadership from some leaders, Pope Francis, the encyclical Laudato Si, which finally integrates environmental concern with social justice and eco-justice. He's calling it integrated ecology. That is a new move. It's very, very important. And there's a Laudato Si movement to back that up. And I'm on a Vatican group that I listen in and learn a lot. And it's happening in other parts of the world, I can really assure you. And his good friend, Bartholomew, the Greek Orthodox patriarch, has been saying this for years, even before the Pope. The earth is sacred. It's an icon. And he had symposiums all over Europe around water issues, actually. So you can look for that online. And the Dalai Lama, of course, has been talking about interdependence for years. Now, so we have things moving out and leaders, some of whom are involved in this week, as you noted. We have statements. We have huge bibliographies. If you look at our website on the Christianity section, it has just loomed. Projects, books, conferences, etc. Now, coming to Brian's question, on the ground, in the church, in the synagogues, in the temples, and so on. I think this is where we have a long way to go still, or we have a ways to go. And why? My question to this question is, are we more worried about the unraveling of our churches or the unraveling of the earth? You know, this whole sense that mainline churches are losing membership. Why? They're not addressing the most important issue on the planet. And why would young people come there instead of being protesting on Fridays for their future? You see, when we get this, and when we do a truly intergenerational discussion on this, we have all kinds of new energies coming forward. Now, I do want to say, and this is why the field and the force need to keep working together. The biblical studies, more recently, because it's taken a long time, but they have gotten on board. And we've got tremendous resources now on how the Bible can be interpreted in an ecologically astute way. And maybe one of the most important resources that have been also blossoming is liturgy. Now, if our churches and synagogues and so on can't do this liturgically, then we're lost, because we are creatures of this great ritual. And rituals are earth-based rituals in many ways, cosmic rituals. Incarnation, what is this? This is the sacredness in the whole earth. So the resources, seasons of creation. Anne Rowthorne and her husband Jeffrey, who's an Episcopal priest, has an amazing book. I want to get the title here: God's Good Earth, Praise and Prayer for Creation. God's Good Earth, Praise and Care for Creation. Every single day, they've identified biblical passages and poetry and so on that can be used in liturgy. So this is very exciting, I think. And I could speak about many other resources, but the biblical changes, the liturgical changes, the actual changes on the ground, projects that are restoring creation, restoring rivers and forests and fisheries, it's exploding. And that's how communities can be involved. I'm right here in the Long Island Sound, and religious communities are helping with that kind of restoration and taking down dams and so on. So there's lots to be done, lots more ahead of us. And that's what's exciting, things to be done.
Beautiful. I want to give you, Brian, the chance to respond. Yes.
Yeah. First, Mary Evelyn, that sense that you are so right, I couldn't agree more, that over the last 50 plus years, there's been this huge amount of scholarship done, theology, biblical studies, and there have been people stepping out, poets and liturgists creating new resources. It's as if we have this huge bank full of incredible resources now. And it really is the moment for individual clergy, rabbis, ministers, priests, to just say, we can't wait for anybody's permission or or command. We've got to start doing it because the
Right.
resources are there. And if anyone is ready, the resources are there. And where we could be in 5 or 10 years with just more and more people gaining permission and in a sense giving themselves permission to do this innovation, I think people could really, really be surprised.
Yeah.
And I wonder, Ben, if I could just say something about your question about institutions. This has been something I've been thinking about really my whole adult life, and I'm going to try to summarize something in a very, very simple way. And the way I see it at this moment, for what it's worth, is that we human beings exist as individuals in communities, institutions, and movements. And if you have those three realities, communities, institutions, and movements, Wendell Berry defines a community as a group of people who are tied together because of their interdependence with an environment. So if you're in a watershed, you're especially connected to other people in that watershed. But we, in a sense, are part of global communities because we're part of a global environment as well. And so communities are in some ways our biological context. Institutions are anything that lasts longer than a generation. If something lasts longer than a generation, it's got institutions supporting it. And people very often see our institutions malfunctioning and they become anti-institutional. But I would just urge people to realize it's because we need institutions to function better that we shouldn't just throw them out when they function badly. That's when we have to imagine newer and better and more resilient and responsive institutions. And then if we add to that movements, and here's maybe a way to think about movements and institutions. Movements exist to challenge communities and institutions to grow. Institutions exist to maintain the growth achieved by past movements. So if we can see that kind of dynamic relationship, both institutions and movements are intended to serve communities. Now, we live in a time when many of our institutions are failing, and that's where we need movements to organize people, to challenge those institutions to new gains. And if the institutions refuse, then we just have to create new institutions. And that's not easy, but sometimes it's necessary. So I don't know, that maybe that those three might help us to think in a little more balanced and integrative way about the need and power of institutions.
Yeah. And I would say that's so beautifully stated and so clear. And here's the thing, is that all institutions are breaking down at this point, right? Yeah. So we've got political institutions insufficient to carry the concerns into the future. We've got social institutions that are, very insufficient. We've got educational and religious. These are the four major institutions that are being rebuilt, reconstructed. Religion, economics, society, politics, and here's the thing, we're at this moment of breaking down to break through. So we now have back to your question on economics, Brian, Catherine Tanner here at the Divinity School did the Gifford lectures on the problem with economics, you see, and that value change. John Cobb and Herman Daly did something on the common good many years ago. So again, we have things to build on for a new circular economy that's not going to devour everything. We've got a whole range, but the problem has been, and again, I think you're so attuned to this, Brian, that because of this polycrisis, because of the explosion of the environmental crises, fundamentalisms invariably emerge. And that's what we're seeing with politics, yes. Autocratic and yes. Fundamentalist politics, with economics, neoliberal economics, where capitalism is more important than people. And in religious communities around the world, India with the BJP party and Modi, the prime minister, that is a tremendously fundamentalist position where Muslims are excluded. And in Israel, the Likud party has a very difficult time with the Palestinians and so on. And of course, the Muslim community have their own forms of fundamentalism, and so do we in the US. And that's what we have to break through to assure people. And again, Brian, I think you're doing this so well. Assure people that the uncertainty of our moment means we need new spiritual answers and stories and integration. And instead of separating and saying, this is wrong, this is right, we need to listen and integrate and go beyond fundamentalisms. But Brian, I know you probably want to say something because your whole life has been doing that so richly.
Well, I'm sure Ben has some other questions he wants to ask, but let me just say what a gift that is to say fundamentalism is the understandable, predictable reaction of anxious people to times of change without easy solutions being obvious. But then to say, and it's the same psychological construct, whether it's in politics, economics, religion, education, whatever, that this fundamentalist, regressive, frightened return to something in the past is absolutely understandable and absolutely self-sabotaging at this moment.
Yeah, yeah.
What an extraordinary dialogue. I knew this was going to be good, but absolutely just tremendous amount of depth and richness here. And that urge, that longing for certainty, that is part of the human condition. How, what certainties can we offer? What certainties can religions, what new certainties or what ancient certainties, however we may want to frame that, can religion offer? Brian, your talk just before about communities, institutions, and movements was just so, elegant. It sounds like there's a book in there, but also incredibly relevant to this entire conversation that we're having this week, which has got so many sideds to it. Mary Evelyn, you talk about the polycrisis, and the response to the polycrisis, of course, is a holistic, whole systems approach, where one thing can't be separated from another thing. So the work that you're doing between religion and ecology, of course, is a great example of that, standing on the shoulders of giants like Thomas Berry and many others. But as we go into what are the certainties that religion can offer us, if we're moving away from the old models, Brian, you talked about the evacuation plan, getting to heaven. That's kind of a concept that many of us grew up with. But what are the new certainties? And I know Patrick Carolan will come in soon, and he is such an advocate for the idea that Jesus and St. Francis really were talking about instituting, if you like, heaven here on earth. So let's talk about that for a few moments. What do you think in a time of wild uncertainty? What are the certainties that religion can offer the individual? Mary Evelyn, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm not sure about certainty. That's the whole point, isn't it? I mean, I love Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. As a young person, that meant so much to me. And just one phrase there I offer, and that was live the questions. Live the questions, that we don't have to have certainty surround us to go forward. And here's the thing. We have people doing eco-theology within Christianity and the other traditions. We have the interreligious and we have interspiritual. We have a spectrum. Then that's what's exciting. It's a spectrum. So there's not one right answer here. But I want to just offer into the mix is 85% of the world's people still say they are religious, even though we have hyper-secularism in Western Europe especially and so on. And even in this country, and hyper in academia, which is a real challenge to live within that framework that just resists anything religious. But we also have the largest educational institutions in the world are religious. More than 50% of them are religious. I just gave a talk this summer to Jesuit alums in Barcelona. There's 7 to 10 million Jesuit alums because they have 200 universities around the world and 600 high schools. Now they are taking Laudato Si, this integrated ecology, and making it part of their curriculum. And every president is making a commitment. It's taking some time to have all 200, but that is a watershed of religion and ecology in this huge institution. And the financial resources that these religions bring, as we know, sometimes for good and for ill. But let's just take the divestment movement, which is not that old, a little more than 10, 12 years maybe, when Bill McKibben launched this divestment from oil and gas and coal and so on. It's now at $40 trillion. It's extraordinary. And a third of that is from religious communities. And religious communities started socially responsible investment for their pension funds. So, this is not just be good, feel great, and love nature. This has institutional consequence. Back to Brian's point of quite extraordinary measure. And maybe at another question, I'm going to read a passage from a new statement from the World Council of Churches on the living earth. It is the best statement I have heard. It's September 8th. It just came out. And Ben can put it in the chat. But it says we've got to go beyond anthropocentrism, beyond the human-centered concerns. It's fabulous, a watershed. So I'm just mentioning these very exciting indicators of what institutions can do to make changes.
I just want to quickly jump in there, Brian, before we hear your response, and then we'll bring Patrick Carolan up here. I love that, Mary Evelyn, that religion can't offer the certainties that maybe people are craving in a childlike way, but can offer mystery, adventure, meaning, purpose, and community, and everything that's tied up with what you just offered then. That's beautiful. Brian, what would you like to offer on this one?
Well, I just want to amen everything that Mary Evelyn just said. Maybe what we could propose to people is that certainty is overrated, because you can be, certainty is a psychological state, and you can be certain and be absolutely wrong. Mm-hmm. All of us, we can look back in our lives and think, I was certain I was making the right decision. And then I realized my motives were so mixed, and what a foolish decision. So certainty is overrated. And I think one of the things we'd like to help people get certainty about is that certainty is overrated. And what I think we need instead is clarity. Clarity and a clear sense of priorities. And this is a place where our religious communities could stand up and offer clarity. This is where when we mentioned Pope Francis with Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, these statements where he offers absolutely needed clarity about what our priorities should be at this moment, or the World Council of Churches with this powerful new statement. This is the kind of clarity that we can give. And what's interesting for me as a Christian is noticing in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who, he's the largest single contributor of New Testament literature. He says, the only thing that matters is faith that expresses itself in love. And elsewhere he says, it doesn't matter if you have knowledge, if you have all kinds of piety, if you don't have love, it's worth exactly nothing. So what Paul has absolute clarity on is that love is the priority. And this to me is where our religious communities could say, it's time for us to grow up. We've been obsessed with 100 different things. Let's put the main thing as the main thing. And let's talk about love for ourselves, love for our neighbors, love for the outsider, the outcast, the enemy, love for the earth, love for the whole. And in that way, let's understand the love of God not being separate from those things, but integral to all of those other loves. When that happens, I think we have the clarity that people need. We have a priority that people need. And And I think that'll be way better than the old certainties we offered.
Love it.
When that happens, Brian, we'll have religion to the rescue, I think.
That's right. That's right.
So, Mary Evelyn, let's take a moment for you to read that statement on the World Council of Churches, and then we'll bring in a co-host, Patrick Carolan.
Okay. So it begins with, together we believe the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Human beings created in God's own image are called to serve. Now I can't quite see it. Okay. Are called to serve as faithful and responsible caretakers of God's precious, unique creation, of which we are at the same time an inherent part and inextricably dependent on the health of the whole natural world. A narrow anthropocentric understanding of our relationship with creation must be revised to a whole of life understanding to achieve a sustainable global ecosystem. We are all interdependent in God's whole creation. As Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity this week, we are called to metanoia and a renewed and just relationship with creation that expresses itself in our practical life. This is just tremendous. It's very, very exciting and good for WCC. We're going to push it out as far as we can.
That is beautiful, and getting such a diverse body of ecumenical groups to agree to a statement as progressive, if you like, as that is quite an achievement. So thank you, Mary.
By the way, that's just the opening paragraph. This is long and specific of what we need to do. It's excellent. It's excellent.
One question that maybe is in the chat here that's perhaps a little more challenging. We'll just speak to it for a moment before Patrick comes on. Frank Thacker asks about the doctrine of discovery. We know, and this is something that comes up a lot with indigenous communities around the world, the papal bulls, from the early part of the last, or the mid part of the last millennium. In some sense, there's a lot of very negative emotions around this and a deep hurt around this. The Pope Francis, when he was in Canada recently, offered an apology to Indigenous people for specific atrocities that had taken place, but did not retract or take a step towards retracting those papal bulls, which the doctrine of discovery gave cover to in some senses. Mary Evelyn, would you have liked to have seen him go further, or would you like to see even more being done to heal the hurts of the past in this particular example?
Well, I'm so glad this has come up. My husband, John Grimm, is a specialist, a student of indigenous traditions, especially Native American. And clearly, this is an issue that's being picked up, frankly, by a lot of the religious communities. The nuns and sisters are very engaged in this. We just met last week with Phil Arnold and his wife, Sandra Bigday, who are at Syracuse, and they're leading some of the discussions with the Haudenosaunee people on this doctrine of discovery. And the short answer is things are really happening. And I think, I hate to predict things, but I suspect even in our lifetime, we will see this change. I just want to have Brian have a chance to say something too, but when we were on one of these symposiums with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in the Amazon, with scientists, with policy people, with UN people and religious leaders, in the middle of the Amazon, the Patriarch was on a boat and we were on small boats around it. And he is the one who began apologizing to indigenous people. The Pope has picked it up in beautiful ways. But the Patriarch, with indigenous peoples surrounding him, made apologies for forced conversion, etc. And they accepted it. So that is a movement that will not go backwards. And it's going to take a long time, reparations and so on, and school systems and abuse. But we're at a beginning phase of it. Brian, I want to hear if you have something to say as well.
Well, first, I think these are super promising signs, and we need to just keep bringing up the doctrine of discovery again and again. I suspect that if we take the doctrine of discovery as seriously as we need to, we're going to have to go very deep and identify a narrative that's deeply embedded in the Christian faith. And I think we could find counterparts in other faiths, in many other faiths as well. And that is, it's a narrative of domination. The idea that we're only safe if our group is in control. And this whole narrative of domination, I'm sad to say this, but I think it has to be said. It even in some ways resides in our definitions of God. Many of us think of God as a dominating personality, a personality who has absolute and ultimate domination. And I think one of the things we're going to, we heard that word metanoia a few minutes ago, we're going to have a change of mind, a change of thought, a change of perspective, is to say, the idea of domination is a really terrible idea. What we need is not domination. What we need is integration. What we need is a participation in a larger whole where we all have work to do. And that is a deeply spiritual change of the way that we see the whole world, to move beyond those old domination narratives, many of which have so much theology connected with them. Our theology will be liberated when we liberate it from that idea of domination.
Thank you. Thank you for going to the root of that. I think this conversation we could continue for a long, long time, and perhaps down the track we'll have you both back on Religion to the Rescue. I know, Brian, in a few moments you'll need to leave. We're grateful that Mary Evelyn can stay with us. But Patrick, Carolan, co-host of this Zoomcast, this is our first episode, of course. Patrick, welcome, and it's been awesome so far.
It really has. It's just, and we knew it would be when Ben and I talked about doing this, and the first two people we thought of bringing together was Mary Evelyn and Brian. So we're both so grateful that you could be here and could be here together with us. And I loved everything that you were talking about. We could do this for about 3 or 4 hours. And actually, I think both of us have had these discussions for about 3 or 4 hours. So I want to just bring up a point, and if you have a couple moments, Brian, you could respond to this also. But I know you're very familiar with this, Mary Evelyn. Thomas Berry wrote in his book, The Christian Future and the Fate of the Earth. And he wrote, "We'll go into the future as a single sacred community, or we will perish in the desert." I'm pretty sure, you know this way better than I do, Mary Evelyn. I'm pretty sure Thomas Berry wasn't talking about a single religion. And I'm pretty sure he wasn't talking about our rites and our rituals and prayer and anything like that at all. So maybe, I'll throw that question out for each of you. Brian, you can go first because I know you have to leave. What is it that he was talking about, and how do we come together as a single sacred community?
We used that word fundamentalism earlier, and one of the characteristics of fundamentalism is it says that our group is the group that should dominate. Our group is the group that should have supremacy, whether it's our economic group, our political party, our nation over other nations, our religion over other religions, our sect of our religion over other sects of our religion. And that kind of fundamentalism is what, in a certain sense, is only interested in our little us, in saving our little us, and to hell with everybody else. And and that's where I think Thomas Berry understood that if that's our mentality, we only care about our racial group, our religious group, our economic group, our political group, our ideological group. If we only care about us and we don't care about anybody else, then we're not going to get through this tight point that we're in. And this is, again, deeply spiritual for us to develop a universal love that says my neighbors matter, all of my neighbors, the ones I like, the ones I don't, the ones I agree with, the ones I don't. But also the trees matter, the coral reefs matter, the plankton spread across the surface of the ocean matters. It all matters. And we're part of this one Earth community. Oh my gosh, that is to me so inspiring. It's in the deepest sense of the word holy. and anything less is a huge disappointment, and doesn't deserve our highest allegiance anymore. And I will have to sign off in just a minute. So what a pleasure to be with you. And I wish I'll have to come back and hear the rest of the recording.
Thank you so much, Brian. So fantastic.
Thank you, Brian.
And just a quick response, because I see something in the chat from Matthew Brower that relates here, because he's saying, how can we bring in the Asian traditions and indigenous traditions? And that's just what John and I have tried to do for many, many years, because just as Brian has said, the Asian Confucianism that I study in particular, their triad or trinity is cosmos, earth, and human, and that the human completes the universe and is part of the earth community, but that the comprehensive compassion for the whole, for people and the living earth community, is the way to be human, to cultivate a spiritual path. So there's lots of resources that we can bring into this discussion. And Patrick and Ben, I turn it back to you for your concerns and questions.
So there's a question in the chat room from Susan, that I think is really good. It's and I apologize, Susan, if I don't read it quite right, but it's, how does acknowledging the historical and current horrors of white supremacy, racism in Christian stories and situations, and how do they lead into what can we do to bring the needed changes in religion? I kind of scribbled it down, so I'm not sure if I got it exactly right. But really the question, the whole story of white supremacy, and it's not just white supremacy and racism, but sexism. And, I think your colleague, Elizabeth Johnson at Yale, wrote a book about stewardship. And she talked about how our religion, you and Mary, Brian both talked about dominionism a little bit and moving away from that. And, about 50 years ago, we started moving away from dominionism and moved into stewardship. And we talk about stewardship of creation, care for creation. I wrote an article recently and I said, stewardship is nothing more than a dominionist with a conscience. And so the whole idea, as Elizabeth Johnson talks about it, of stewardship is it's hierarchical, and there is somebody's up here and we're in charge of taking care of everything else below us. And then we define the we. And the we in Western culture is white male. The we in most culture is male, but in Western culture, it's white male. So stewardship is and it's part of our theology, but it's a model that really led to feminism, not feminism, but anti-feminism and racism. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, and how, not just the issue of white supremacy, but all of it, moving away from the theology of stewardship into a theology, which we can talk about, and we're going to talk about at our next session, that John Duns Scotus described as kinship with creation.
Sure, yeah, very, very important. Elizabeth Johnson's at Fordham, and she.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's all right. We need all theologians on deck. So there's a number of questions in that question, clearly.
Yes.
But that's why I read the passage from WCC, Patrick, right to your point, that we need to move beyond an anthropocentric, human-centered position. And clearly, beyond a human-centered position that is white male. And we can talk about this forever, but again, since George Floyd's death, we are moving, even though there's tremendous suffering and tremendous horrors that we're still seeing, no question. I mean, Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, the lynching museum in Alabama, it's extraordinary work that's being done. Just watch the film of him advocating for people on death row, and African Americans in particular. So these issues, be they racial, be they women's issues, Roe v. Wade, the explosion of women's response is just extraordinary. Feminism, I grew up in a male-dominated world. My whole experience in academia is male-dominated. I was the first to be tenured here and there. It's an extraordinary, excruciating experience. So we are moving, though. We are absolutely moving. And that's where we may say one step forward, two backward, but we've got to keep going forward on the racial issues, on the patriarchy issues, and all kinds of inclusion issues, LGBT and et cetera. So, but we need not just, I think, a sense of the politics of identity, which can be very divisive. And this is why this Peace Week and the Unity Earth is very, very important. Because if we don't bring together a deeper sense of what we belong to, and that's also why the WCC statement is so important, living Earth. If you look up, we did a whole conference on this topic, Living Earth Community, Indigenous Voices, David Abrams' Spell of the Sensuous, people like Edward Cohn writing on Thinking Like a Forest. This is a living Earth community, and that's what holds us together. 9,000 people signed up for a webinar last semester on old growth forests because of the communicating depths of roots and mycelium and so on. What's exploding in the science world, the forest world, in the world of animal cognition and communication is an amazing resource for this sense of unity and what we belong to. So again, we've got a long way to go, but very, very good signs that the living Earth community will be that which carries us forward if we respect and revere it as well, more than an it, more than something objectified.
Right. Thank you. And that just brings up, this is where we get to do a little bit of an advertisement, because our next podcast, Zoomcast, is going to be on October 23rd, Sunday night. We're doing this whole series of these over the next year, Ben and I. And that one, we're going to focus on the similarities between St. Francis of Assisi and Rumi, and more importantly, between the Franciscans and the Sufis. And again, bring into the discussion of the singular spirituality, or community of spirituality. Because if you know anything about St. Francis and Rumi, if you have ever read their poetry, you notice that they're very identical. And there's a reason for that. And so that's going to be our next session. But sticking with this session, since we have you, Mary Evelyn, we're going to just keep picking your brain some more. Brian had mentioned Lynn White. I was so happy he mentioned Lynn White. But another person about 100 years before Lynn White was John Muir, who started the Sierra Club. I gave a talk once at the Sierra Club, and they wanted to have me give a talk about how faith faith groups and environmental groups could come together and to talk about climate change. And I said, John Muir was an extremely spiritual person. If he were running the Sierra Club today, every one of your messages would be a faith message. But John Muir said we have to discover the presence of the divine in nature. And when I think about that expression, the presence of the divine in nature, a lot of times, and again, it gets back to the stewardship question, people think about it and they say, I look outside and I can see God's beautiful creation. I can see how wondrous God is because of God's beautiful creation. That's not what John Muir is talking about, I don't think. I think John Muir is talking about, I can look outside and I look at the trees and I can see God. And, just to give you a little teaser for the next session, it gets to that question, St. Francis of Assisi would often go out and preach the gospel to the birds. And it wasn't some hokey, talk to Dr. Doolittle, talk to the animals kind of thing. People asked him why he did that. And he said, these are my brothers and sisters. And God told me to preach the gospel to my brothers and sisters. So talk to us a little bit about that whole concept of kinship of creation and the presence of the divine in all of nature, not just seeing God's work in nature, but experiencing God in nature.
Yeah, what a great question, Patrick. I think that's a really critical point because, again, it comes back to creation care, stewardship. Is it, us taking care of, or are we participating in a living Earth community? And what I think we still need, you see, is this cosmological sense. Now that might sound abstract, but it's not. Why are these new Webb telescope pictures absolutely mesmerizing people of the universe, of stars, of galaxies, and so on? Because scientists are even weeping when they see this context of a universe filled with galaxies and stars and systems we barely understand, that we're part of a 13.8 billion year unfolding process, and it was 10 billion years with galaxies and stars and 4.6 billion of our Earth systems emerging. This takes every sense of a living creature and species into a new context, because it deepens our sense of reverence and care. That these species have come into being over such deep time means we need to value them. So once we put that back into our mind-body system, the stars are our ancestors and so on, this isn't just, it's an expanded sense of kinship, an absolutely huge sense of kinship. I want to read, in response to that beautiful question, Patrick, something that Gorbachev said. Gorbachev, what an explosion of writing around his death, right? His longest obituary I've ever seen in the New York Times. But one thing they missed is that Gorbachev, because of his wife and his own Orthodox background, had a tremendous sense of the beauty, complexity of the Earth itself. And he was a leader of the Earth Charter. Now, here's just a very brief statement. This is Gorbachev. I believe in the cosmos. All of us are linked to the cosmos. So nature is my God. To me, nature is sacred. Trees are my temples and forests are my cathedrals, being at one with nature. That's John Muir too, right? These were cathedrals. So this sensibility is very widespread. We need to affirm it and bring it forward as the sacred earth community.
Great, thank you. I don't know if you've read the book. I just read recently the book, Finding the Mother Tree. And
yes.
Just an absolute. I actually sent a note to the author of it. And I said to her, I know that you think you were writing a science book, but you actually wrote a spiritual book. And it's
that's why I'm saying 3 major authors on trees and forests, including Robin Kittimer, David Haskell, Song of Trees, and Rob McFarlane, leading nature writer in the UK. 9,000 people signed up to hear the sense of the communication of trees. Yale has never had anything close to that as a webinar.
Yeah.
So the spiritual energy that is already there in these systems that people want contact with is right in front of us. It's amazing, and what the nature writers are giving a sense of this. It's very exciting. Back to you, Patrick.
Another question that's in the chat box from Chief Perry, and you sort of touched on this a little bit, but maybe you want to touch a little more on it, is how do you see the blending of the actualization of tactile spirituality of the global indigenous with the intellectualizing of formal organized religion?
No, great question too. Gosh, we should really have John answer that question.
Well, you can get him on and answer it if you want. If he's here, we can put him on.
I wonder if John knows Chief Perry. Chief Perry is of the Ramapo Lenape, Mary Evelyn, and it's great to have him here with us, asking such a beautiful question. Let's go ahead.
Fantastic. Well, John is very close to the Crow tribe, and we're adopted into a family there. And of course, Oran Lions and the Haudenosaunee are very close to us as well. But I think that's such a beautiful question, because just as we have to integrate the sense of science and spirituality, we have to integrate the tremendous sensibilities, complex sensibilities of indigenous peoples and communities in their spiritual life way, as John would say, and in their commitment to reverence and respect for not just resources, but the sources of life in which we dwell. So I think that not only do we have a lot to learn from indigenous spirituality, but that a dialogue with Christians, with Buddhists, with Hindus and Confucians. This is, I think, very much not just in the future, it's happening right now because of this renewed appreciation for indigenous spirituality. And that's where all of this has to be dialogical, to come back to these deep unities that draw us together, which is this Peace Week. So I'm just saying, yes, yes, yes. This is something we need to do, we will do, and is already happening, I think.
Great, thank you. And let me take it in a little different direction now. And this is, a person who's a friend of both yours and mine, and has been on our on Unity Earth podcast in the past, and we hope to get her back on this, is Ilia Delio. And Ilia talks a lot about our sacred stories and talks about how evolution is our sacred story. And so talk about that a little bit, if you, I see we actually tricked you because Ben sent you the questions he was going to ask ahead of time, and I'm just springing these questions on you. So
no, they were all, Ben's questions were all spontaneous too. So this is
they
fun.
were, yes.
Yeah, but let's give lineage its due, because Teilhard de Chardin is the first one to really recognize.
Yeah, I did mean to mention his name first, but yeah.
Yeah, and then the person, so Teilhard, Jesuit, paleontologist, an extraordinary sense of the integration of science and religion, especially in deep evolutionary time. But it was Thomas Berry who took that forward to say we need to tell it as a story. And Brian Swim and he did it in the Universe Story. We've done it in Journey of the Universe, a film, a book, podcasts, online classes. So we have things to work with now. But it was the genius, really, of Teilhard against great suffering and great lack of appreciation from his own Jesuit order. And the same with Thomas Berry. So I really want to hold up those who have integrated this in their writings and their thinking. Extraordinary. And Brian to tell it as a story. So of course, this is a sacred evolutionary story. That Sacred Universe is the title of one of Thomas's last books. And we edited them, all of them. And when Columbia Press said to us, we always chose a title of one of his essays to put as the title of the book, The Great Work, Dream of the Earth, and so on. When Columbia, a secular press, said, let's call this book Sacred Universe, we were blown away. Because again, it says, definitely this is a sacred universe. And that's what Berry could evoke over and over again for people in his talks, in his writing, that were very much inclusive of all the world's religions, but didn't have to be referential or rhetorical. So that sense of a sacred universe is very, very profound. And Ilya's picking up on it, but Teilhard and Thomas really gave it the grounding, for no question. And I'm thrilled.
Absolutely.
People are picking up on it. And the other person I'd love to hold up is John Haught, who did his work at Georgetown. So we've got a number of people doing this in very creative ways. It's very exciting.
And it sort of brings up another question then. It's something I've written about and others have, but it is, we talk about our sacred stories, and we, for whatever reason, we sort of have this, and I say we, I mean the big we, not you and I or others, but just this sort of sense or understanding that our sacred stories all happened 2,000 years ago. And then they ended, and that's it. There are no more sacred stories after the Gospels and the letters. And then for whatever reason, occasionally there would be, a holy person like Hildegard or Francis or somebody that come along, or in the Muslim community, certainly lots of them. And but our sacred stories ended there, and they were cast in stone. Then they're not ever changing and ever, evolving. And so, share a little bit about that and your perspective on that. And let me also just say, I've read every one of your Thomas Berry's books that you've edited, so thank you for that. They're great.
Patrick, we're so appreciative of your work, and especially with the Franciscan tradition. But this is the point, that there are well springs of creativity. I mean, that Pope Francis took the name of Francis is just extraordinary and so important. So, and we did many conferences in Assisi inspired by Franciscan spirituality. How could we not, over the years? So I think, if I'm hearing you, creation stories became not fossilized exactly, but like end of story in a way.
Yes.
But here's the thing. Creation stories were meant to be liberative, were meant to be enacted, performed, and so on. And I think that also can happen, but it's respecting the diversity of the stories from the various world religions, but also saying they're necessary but not sufficient without this infusion of extraordinary body of scientific knowledge, from galaxies to living Earth systems. And the exciting thing is, that's why these stories are not over. And we did a whole conference at Yale on Christian responses to Journey of the Universe. It's a book, and it was fabulous from every sect of Christianity, Orthodox and Reform and Evangelical and so on. So that dialogue is what really needs to happen, so that the livingness of story and science and spirituality are integrated. And let me just conclude, because it's such an important question, that I couldn't say, everything, but our grandparents had no knowledge really of evolution in the dimensions that we do now. So that is truly exciting, that at every branch of science, there's a contribution to this sense of a story that integrates and gives us a feeling of belonging. The universe is opening up that space for us to participate in and align ourselves with, and therefore be more ecologically, spiritually attuned to what needs to be done. That's what solar power is about, wind power. It's aligning with the forces of the natural world for an energy transformation that's ahead.
Great, thank you. I'll share a little story. I worked for the Franciscans for many years, and when Pope Francis was first elected and took the name of St. Francis, and Pope Francis was a Jesuit, and so people would ask us how we felt, the Franciscans, how we felt about Pope Francis being a Jesuit and taking the name of St. Francis. And I said that, all of us through our youth and our youthful exuberance have made mistakes and errors. And we're just so grateful that our Holy Father saw the errors of his ways as he got older. And so I actually had the chance to tell that to Pope Francis at one point in time, and he just laughed and agreed with me. So I think we're running close to the end. I don't see many more questions in the chat box. Ben, do you have any more questions that you want to bring, or any more
I do have one question. It may be a little cheeky, but I feel compelled to ask it, Mary Evelyn. And I ask this, with a light heart. But what religion are you?
But before you answer that, Mary Evelyn, Ben and I actually had this discussion
with Peter Blaise as well. With Peter Blaise, there were many different answers, by the way.
So.
Yes.
Well, in today's world, aren't we all multi-religious, multicultural, intergenerational? I like to say to my students, it's an intergenerational handshake. But I grew up in what I would call progressive social justice Catholic tradition, and fortunately, I got the openness of that tradition, which many people have not, and how they've been raised or whatever. And always supporting the poor, the needy, the outcasts, and so on. So that's been a gift in my life. But the huge gift was going to Japan and teaching at a university there and beginning to learn Buddhism. This is 73, 74, and Japan and Asia was not developed as it is now. And I traveled all through Asia. And the presence of Buddhism, I've learned so much from it. The presence of Shinto and going to all these shrines, and the extraordinary impact of Confucianism all across Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. I've been to all these countries, and it's an amazing tradition. So, and of course, I've been to India many, many times and done conferences there on the Yamuna River and so on and so forth. So Hinduism means a great deal. Sufism that you've just mentioned, I've been to conferences in Iran and in the Middle East. So all of these traditions are pouring forth, I think, not just little springs, but tsunamis of wisdom. And my grandfather, who taught history at Columbia, was one of the founders of the National Conference of Christian and Jews. And I feel everything we're trying to do in this interreligious and multi-religious and interspiritual context is following the footsteps of many, many people before us. And I'll end with the note that Thomas Berry, his understanding of these traditions and his call for a new story continues to be an inspiration to us every day. He was a remarkable, charismatic, inspired, and humble person, a great, great gift to so many people. So Ben, I want to thank you for hosting great questions from Patrick and all the people in the chat. I'm so thrilled that Gary Malcolm had a wonderful comment there, friends from the past, and Peter Blaze, a very, very dear friend. So I thank you. And of course, Brian McLaren, what a joy to be with him. Thank you, each one of you and all you participating.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn. I mean, not just for being here today, it was a joy to have you here, but for everything that you've done. I know when I first started out my career at the Franciscans, you were one of the first people I talked to and guided and mentored me. And so I'm grateful for everything that you've done for all of us throughout the years, and what a leader you've been. And an example, you know, it's St. Francis taught us it's not what we say, but how we live our life. And you and I also want to just say, John, too, you and John together have been just such an example for all of us of what it means to be Christian, even if you're not Christian. So thank you for that.
Well, you're very kind, and John really deserves the biggest shout out. I couldn't do anything without him, and we do everything together from breakfast to dinner discussing stuff. And maybe we could just draw into this wonderful mix of all the faces I'm seeing there in the chat and so on. September 27th is the 60th anniversary of the publication of Silent Spring of Rachel Carson. Now, what an inspired woman, deeply spiritual, clearly, and a person who had to deal with so much. Her papers are here at Yale, and we take students to see them each semester, and it's a mind-boggling spiritual event. They come out of it just in awe of someone who really launched the environmental movement, right? Along with many, many others. But it was a spiritual, scientific integration that she had. So let's continue that work and raise a glass, raise a cheer for her on September 27th next week for the 60th anniversary of Silent Spring. May the birds continue to sing. Thank you.
Mary Evelyn, you might mention to John that one of our future episodes we want to do on the indigenous people. So we're going to be actually calling him and asking him to come on and
wonderful.
talk about
I'm sure he'd enjoy it
as well.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll love it. Again, thank
and
you
Mary
so
Evelyn,
much.
Just for me, deep gratitude to you and Brian for coming in and lighting up Peace Week 2022 with a bright light of illumination of a positive and hopeful pathway forward for all of us and for all of life. Thank you for this gift, and what a wonderful beginning to Religion to the Rescue. Thanks to you. Thank you, Patrick, and Peter Blaze and everybody involved, but Mary Evelyn mostly for you and your time and your generosity today. Thank you.
Thank you.